This video is what is art? We're asking the big question about what it really is. So we've talked about how you can incorporate this into other kinds of writing, not just literary writing, but we're focused on literary. And what I want to tell people is you have to answer this big question first, whether you want to be a literary writer, whether you want to incorporate it into other kinds of writing. To intro, I have an MFA in fiction. Lucky for you, I taught philosophy for 30 years. So it gives me a unique perspective on how to answer the bigger question, which is what is art? And I do want to touch on the first video we made, which is the difference between art and genre, because I think a lot of genre writers go in thinking they know literary technique when they don't. So it makes sense to kind of build a preliminary definition. And I do that philosophically because I feel like that training has benefited me in terms of explaining things in a broader, more general sense. And more importantly, fundamentally, which means if we can understand art philosophically, we can apply it to any technique in any story. So the way I want to explain it is something I call lens theory or ways of knowing. The three major ways that people learn about their world. But at the end of the video, I'm also going to tell you the errors people make in terms of ways of knowing. So number one is science. We have three, what I called in the other videos, pillars of knowing, which is the lens we use for the same thing. We look at the same thing with three different lenses and we learn from them differently. Science is the first one, and that is a lens into the physical world. It uses a scientific method, which incorporates induction, corroboration, correlation, repeatability. These are the things that make it unique, but it also tells you what the conclusions are from the scientific method. Number two is philosophy. You got to remember philosophy is the father of all these things, but in some sense, philosophy competes with art better than it competes with science. And so science, it's more specific, especially to the physical world. And so science and art are more competitive with each other. Let me give you this definition of philosophy before we move on to art. And that is that philosophy's lens uses reason to clarify and reveal fundamental non-scientific truth. That's pretty basic, but it's also pretty complete. So I hope you see the difference. The lens is reason, whereas with science, the lens was the scientific method. So this helps you understand the formula. So now we can talk about art. What is art in terms of lens theory? So when you're learning through art or creating art so that someone else can, you are going to be using metaphor as your lens. And metaphor is one of the major techniques, not the only one, but it works with things like what I call the sub keys of art, which are subtlety, resonance, controlled realism, and universals. So subtlety means that less is more. If you studied Hemingway at all, Hemingway went a little too far into the less is more and was considered one of the fathers of minimalism. And so the reason minimalism was successful, whether it's a novel or a short story, is that the theory, at least my theory, is that the brain adapts better to that subtlety, and the metaphors in these techniques work better rather than being obvious, being lengthy, being confusing. That's actually what they do in philosophy, and that's why philosophy is falling apart right now. The next one's resonance, which works together with theme, which is the major technique we haven't talked about because that's a whole 5-video series. When we talk about the major technique is theme and through line. But when we're talking about resonance, which is a smaller micro expression of theme, it can be used more often and in smaller ways throughout the story. Resonant just means it recurs, which means you tie together different things which resonate with the things before them. And again, it's a theory of art that this is how our brain works. And this is why this particular lens in art teaches us and explores uniquely. Realism controlled means, if you watch the other video, don't be too real. And the way I like to explain it is you prioritize realism, you prioritize story over realism, which means the realism works for your story. And if it doesn't, it's gone. Not realism works for a perfectionist model, which means I have to be absolutely 100% perfectly real at all times. And that's what gets you in trouble when you ignore this art doesn't really mimic life suggestion. And then the last one is universals. Universals are something that you would consider a technique, but it's a little more philosophical, but it also means you tie together all of your technique, including the main one, theme and through line, to something that anyone can understand. So if you're not talking about a universal, you're not talking about something that can actually bridge social, cultural, geographical boundaries, if you're not talking about that, you probably haven't gotten fundamental enough in terms of theme. And so again, this is hard to do without doing a whole 500-part series on theme, which I am going to do next. But just remember that the ideas that you're trying to come up with and you're competing between philosophy and art with are going to be subtle, resonant, somewhat realistic, but also universal to the human experience, not to your experience or your own culture's experience. And that's how you can kind of gauge how fundamental, how deep you're going with your idea. And again, without doing the actual video, it's hard to explain these small components of theme without really defining theme, because today we're just defining art, which is a lens through metaphor, through these sub techniques, with these overarching ideas like theme and through line that teach people differently than science and philosophy. So let's talk about the errors people make for the end of this video. Bad lenses. So a writer named Charles Sanders Peirce, a pragmatist who was really easy to read, really easy to understand. I think that's what he was going for. You should read him. Wrote an essay on different ways of knowing. And so the good way was reason and rationality, basically what you would call good philosophy. The bad ones are the lens of authority, which means you copy authority figures for your belief, and only that, you cement your belief basically on that authority. Another one, which is kind of underestimated, is inertia, which means you do the same thing because you've always done it. And only because you've always done it. That's your cementing of belief, is kind of the way Peirce puts it. And then the last one is intuition, which is tied with a sub way of knowing called religion, which I've intentionally left out because I don't think it's universal. But intuition tells you that your feelings are there in some brute common sense way, and those feelings mean something, and you cement your belief and your knowing, your certainty through the intuition of the feeling. And so Peirce's point was that the intuition, inertia, and authority are all bad, and then you need to turn to the scientific exploration, roughly what we call reason in philosophy. And then if you wanted to tie that to art, it would be more about how the techniques in art are roughly equatable, at least when they're exploring, to the same grand ideas that philosophy does. So that's the what is art section, and it ties into the genre verse, entertainment only writing. And then next we'll talk about the big technique, which is theme and through.